Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Hey guys, Ben DuBose here, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, contributor to Sports Talk 790. Welcome into a special mini-cast episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Karbach Brewing. I'm recording this midday on Sunday, June 23rd. We will have at least one and probably multiple full episodes later this week with Paolo Alves. This is going to be a special short pod to preview draft week for the Houston Rockets and, of course, the start of free agency, which is a few days after that. First round of the draft is on Wednesday, the 26th, and free agency negotiations can officially begin externally on Sunday, the 30th. Rockets also have some team options to decide between the 26th and 30th on the likes of Jock Landale, Jayshawn Tate, Jeff Green, those types of players. So a lot to happen for the Rockets from a business perspective over the next week. You're going to get some new players in the draft, likely free agency as well. So, of course, we'll have you covered right here on the Lager Line, and we'll have more depth in the coming days. This is just going to be an initial preview of the week and things to watch for, because I do think that there have been some changes the last few days that are noteworthy as we go into the final hours before the draft and then the period leading up to free agency. So, starting with the Rockets at number 3. I think most of the mock drafts are coalescing around Reed Sheppard, guard out of Kentucky, and personally I am as well if the Rockets stay at 3. That's the caveat. But I just think that by this point in the process, in previous years, we knew if the Rockets saw a clear best player available. We knew it with Jalen Green in 2021, with Paolo Banchero in 2022, and with Amen Thompson in 2023. We have not heard that anywhere near to the same extent with a prospect in 2024. Now, obviously, in one of those years, Banchero did not become a Rocket, but that was out of Houston's control. That was just a switcheroo by Orlando on draft night. The point is, by this stage of the game, we knew in previous years if the Rockets had a clear BPA. And some will ask, well, why are the Rockets leaking their plans in advance? Have they changed? And I do think it's somewhat noteworthy that there have been far fewer leaks from Houston this time around. As someone that does talk to people on the inside at Toyota Center, I can confirm that it's definitely been a lot quieter than previous years. You aren't getting anywhere near the same level of intel from the Rockets. I don't know that their strategy has changed. I personally think that it's more about this year being more uncertain than in past years. Because I think when they knew what they wanted to do, look, the NBA is a perception-driven league. These narratives matter. So if you can build trust equity with agents, with key influencers in the media, even with the fan base, if we're talking about trade possibilities, other teams in the deal, the Rockets value being transparent. There's value in building trust equity with key stakeholders across the league, because these days how your organization is viewed externally means a lot. And so when the Rockets got to this stage of the game and they knew Rafael Stone and Eli Whitus and the rest of the front office what they wanted to do, then sure, there's some value in building those relationships by being open and honest about what you're trying to do. You don't have to be super secretive for no reason, like the Astros and their constant injuries and a neck sprain turning into Tommy John surgery, something crazy like that. I think the Rockets value being transparent and building that trust equity. And so in previous years, that's led to, if not their plans being totally revealed, us at least having some idea going into the final few days. This year, we don't. It has been a lot quieter. It's been tougher to get information out of Toyota Center, not just for me, I can certainly confirm that, but also from the other folks in media that I've talked to. It seems like the Rockets are a lot more buttoned up this year, and I think it's because they genuinely do not know what they are going to do entering the final 72 hours, and I think that's a new position for them. This draft is not as cut and dried as the last few. But I will say that if there is no best player available, I've said throughout the process, I don't think the Rockets are at a point where you should eliminate anyone from your draft board based on the core 6. In other words, if you come to the end of your process and you think Donovan Mitchell, who they did bring to Houston for a workout and an interview, if you think he's clearly the best player available, I don't think you should steer clear of him simply because of Alperen Şengün. No one is that established just yet. amongst this young core, especially going into the uncertainty of their second contracts. So if you think that Donovan Clingan, even though at this point he's a center only, is BPA, if you think Stephon Castle is BPA, even though like Amen Thompson, he has the questions surrounding his jump shot, then you take it and you worry about the fit later. However, if it's close at the end of the day, and I think it probably is at this point, then the fact that Reed Sheppard with his shooting is a little easier to fit in a variety of roster constructs, that could be something of a tiebreaker. So that's why I think if it's close, then yes, fit can be something of a tiebreaker. And for me, that's where I give Reed a slight leg up on Clingan and Castle, and perhaps even Alex Sarr if he somehow falls, because Sarr, of course, at 7'1" and long wingspan has the upside, but he's something of a project. Reed is someone who, with his shooting and floor spacing and ability to handle the ball, high IQ, should be able to contribute even in year one. The question, of course, is with his long-term upside, but as far as right now, he can do some things that help the Rockets next season. And so if it's close, I do think that could be a tiebreaker if they stay at 3. So in my opinion, that's why most of the mocks, I put together a mock draft roundup for Rockets Wire. I believe our final one went out Sunday morning, and I think 9 of the 10 had Reed to Houston. And I think that's why. I wouldn't say that I would be shocked if it's someone else, but I've said throughout the process that if it's close, then fit can be a bigger criteria. And I think that's where we are. The only beat writer that I've seen within the Rockets community to project someone other than Reed is Kelly Iko of The Athletic. He says that Donovan Clingan leads the Rockets board. Well, for starters, we don't even know if Clingan's going to be on the board. It's still possible he goes to Atlanta at 1 or Washington at 2. But even if Clingan is on the board at 3, Kelly wrote in the same article that Reed Sheppard is closely behind. In my opinion, if it's close, then I think Reed's ability to fit in more constructs could give him the edge relative to the alternatives at number 3. The key phrase here, alternatives at number 3. I think as far as actually picking at 3 or trading down or out, that's where things could get a little interesting, because it's not like the Rockets have to pick at number 3. There have been a few more whispers in recent days of the Rockets looking to move down for future picks, which is something we heard before the draft lottery when we thought the Rockets would be picking at 9 or 10 with that Brooklyn pick as opposed to 3. And of course, the idea is that those future picks have more liquidity when we talk about the Rockets and their ability to make big trades down the line. And that might be more appealing than a prospect that, because you already have a core 6 in place, you would struggle to find minutes for at least out of the chute. So I think that scenario is still in play. There have been whispers that teams later in the lottery, like Memphis at 7, the Spurs at 8, Portland at 7, the Spurs at 8, the Grizzlies at 9, Charlotte at 6, according to Kelly Iko. Really, all of those teams in the 6 through 9 range could potentially want to move up to pick 3, especially if Donovan Clingan is on the board. He seems to have a lot of certainty, very high floor guy, someone who you can stick at the 5 and within the next couple of years make a clear impact for your team if that's a hole for you. So the Rockets have the option, in my opinion, to move down, and that's where the calculus gets a little more complicated. And I think back to the pod we had a couple of weeks ago with Nathan Grubel, Draft Deeper on Twitter, who talked about the Rockets, if they pick Reed, needing to give him the runway to develop in terms of the aspects of his game beyond shooting. Can he become the next Fred VanVleet as a point guard? Can he become a better defender? Are the Rockets able and willing to develop the other aspects of his game? Do they believe in the other aspects of his game? Because if you're just wanting him to be a shooter, to come off screens and space the floor, you can get that through other means. You could sign a Malik Beasley type in free agency. You don't have to use number 3 pick for that. Or you could trade down to 7 or 8 and draft someone like a Dalton Connect or a Devin Carter, who's a little more defensive minded, but the point is something of a high floor role player. You don't have to use the number 3 pick if that's what you view the likely outcome of Reed Sheppard being. You could trade out a little bit, get someone in that same tier, and perhaps get another future asset that you could add to your war chest for deals down the line. So I think that's where the Rockets probably are. I think Reed has the leg up if we're comparing him to other options at pick 3. However, that's not the only possibility on the board for the Rockets. If these other teams want to move up, and I think that's especially possible if Donovan Clingan is on the board at 3, I think what you're hoping for the Rockets in terms of peak optionality is for the 2 French guys, Alex Sarr, Zachary Risacher, to go 1 and 2 in some order. And then if Clingan's on the board at 3, he's the optimal trade-up target. And so if the Rockets aren't sold on Reed and or they're just not sure they have the runway to develop the other aspects of his game, if they think it'd be too hard pairing that with all the other young guys, so many mouths to feed in terms of young developing prospects, then maybe the Rockets say, hey, we don't think we can develop Reed to the point where he would be worth this pick. So we'd be better off trading down a few spots, getting a high floor, lower ceiling role player like a Dalton Connect, Devin Carter, someone along those lines, maybe one of the G League Ignite guys falls, and getting a future pick that could be more valuable to our war chest, because it's been reported time after time that the Rockets want to make a big splash on the trade market, be it this offseason or later. I think that scenario is in play. And as far as whether it pans out, again, some of it is beyond your control. It depends on exactly how the draft board falls and if the guy a team would want to trade up for is actually on the board at 3. And so I think the Rockets are probably likely to take this all the way down to, when they're officially on the clock on Wednesday night, because in terms of extracting peak value, a lot of these teams won't want to give what the Rockets want unless they are for certain that their guy is going to be on the board. And that's probably not going to be the case with how unstable this draft is at the very top. So that's my view of the draft as of Sunday, the 23rd, midday. My guess, and I emphasize that it's a guess because this is not like previous years where everyone, including me, had an inclination, had information fed to me from the Rockets that Jalen, that Banchero, that Amen was their preference. I don't have anything nearly that strong this time, and I think that's because there's a lot of debates still going on within Toyota Center. I don't even know if the Rockets conclusively know, but reading between the lines, reading the tea leaves, and just sort of my guess as I've gone through this process myself, and we've had pods in recent weeks, I think if it's close, then factors like fit can be something of a tiebreaker. And I think amongst the names available at 3, Reed Sheppard is who probably makes the most sense in the vast majority of scenarios. So if you get to the end of your process and you don't think Donovan Clingan or Stephon Castle or Alex Starr or whoever it may be is clearly best player available, then I think Reed's versatility, not necessarily the versatility of his game, but the versatility of how he fits with your roster could give him the upper hand. But that's if you stay at 3. I do think there are scenarios where if you're not that bullish on Reed long-term, or if you're just skeptical on your ability to give him the reps he needs to develop in these other aspects of his game, then maybe you trade down or out for future assets. Or if you just want a role player type, you can get that at a lower spot in the lottery and sort of, two birds with one stone, if you will, as opposed to using just one pick at 3. You can get a player of similar value to the next couple of years and something for your future war chest as well when it comes to the trade market. Now, that's the other thing I'm going to talk about in this mini episode, the trade market, because I am very intrigued by what's going on with 2 situations in particular, Donovan Mitchell in Cleveland and Paul George in Los Angeles. I said before, I don't think the Rockets are really interested at this point in the Brandon Ingram, Mikal Bridges tier, the floor raisers for this particular team, because after finishing at 41 and 41, I think the Rockets are good as is. They should be a winning team next year, assuming health, just by the young guys getting better, adding Tari Eason and Steven Adams to the rotation. And so adding a very good player, but not at the all-star level to this current team, it would help you a little bit, but I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze in terms of what those types of teams would be asking for in terms of assets from your young core, your future draft picks, and so on and so forth. I think if we're talking about all NBA players, and this has been reported by Kelly Iko of The Athletic, the calculus is different. There is value to the certainty. And if you can get a top 15, top 20 legitimate all-star level player, then that raises the floor enough to where there's more appeal to the Rockets. If you put Donovan Mitchell or Paul George, and I mentioned them, Paul George because he could be a free agent this summer as soon as July 1st or June 30th, he has a player option, and then Donovan Mitchell has player option to enter free agency next summer. So the Cavaliers are sort of bringing his situation to a head. Does he want to sign an extension? Reports of late have said that he probably does, but he hasn't yet. And if he doesn't, then the Cavaliers could get more value for Donovan Mitchell by trading him now as opposed to waiting until during the season or next summer. So where I'm at as of, again, midday the 23rd, every day that passes without an agreement, I get more and more curious. And I do think the Rockets would be in on both of those markets, because those are the types of players where if you insert Donovan Mitchell or Paul George to most of the current core, I'm aware you'd have to trade something, but if you upgrade Jalen Green or Dylan Brooks to someone like Donovan Mitchell or Paul George, I think it's reasonable to expect the playoffs next year for the Rockets. I think they would be good enough, deep enough for that to be a realistic scenario. And so that would be appealing in my opinion. It's just a matter of whether that player wants to go to the Rockets and whether the assets would line up in terms of a deal that makes sense for the other team, also making sense for the Rockets. And of course, step one in that process is a player like Donovan or PG, and it could be someone that's not those two. I just mentioned those because those are the popular names on the market right now. They would have to decide to leave where they are at. But with the NBA Finals over and with the window open all around the league for guys to re-sign internally, like we saw Malik Monk re-sign with the Kings, every day that passes without a new contract, without an extension agreement, I get more and more curious because there's value to the teams in being able to plan. Are you going to have Donovan Mitchell? Are you going to have Paul George? That could dictate what you do in the draft. That could dictate what you do in free agency. That could influence how attractive you are in the free agent market, on the trade market. Those teams want to know, and if the answer is no, they don't want to be around, then you want to use the draft and or free agency to start preparing for what's next, those other scenarios. So the teams are incentivized to get clarity, and I also think the players. Look, we saw last summer a situation where James Harden opted in to try and force a trade before he had a deal lined up, and it was 4.5 months of hell. The roadmap to do that is Chris Paul in June of 2017, when he opted in, and it was the Wednesday before free agency, which this year is draft day, and that was when he reached his deal to opt in and be traded to Houston. A situation like last year where James Harden opted in, wanted to force a trade, but didn't have it all lined up. It led to 4 months of hell before he was finally traded during the season in November. I don't think players want that. So teams want clarity and players want clarity as well. They want to be able to figure out what's next and to start preparing for that scenario. And that also allows the team they go to best build out the roster around them. So again, everyone is incentivized to reach a deal as soon as possible. And so every day that passes with the window now officially open, NBA Finals are over, I get more and more suspicious. So just as the last few weeks, I've said the chances of a big name trade, even though it's been reported time and time again that the Rockets are open to making one, have gone down a little bit because we haven't heard a Woj bomb about, a certain player wanting out. Well, at this point, it's sort of the opposite. Now that the season is over, we haven't heard a Woj bomb about that player actually signing an extension where they are. So as days tick off the calendar, especially as we get closer to key inflection points like the draft, like free agency on the 30th, then I get more and more suspicious that maybe there is a path there. And just because there's a path doesn't mean the Rockets are going to close a deal. Again, maybe some team offers more than Houston does, or maybe the player doesn't want to go to Houston because, look, the Rockets are a good situation, 41-41, but it's not like they'd be an immediate title contender even with Donovan Mitchell or Paul George. Houston's, it's a good market, but it's not New York, it's not LA. So even if one of those players does want out, even if the Rockets do have some level of interest, it's far from a guarantee that there would be a deal. It's just every day that passes makes me wonder, hey, is this player looking at leaving? And then if they do, the pathway is there because the Rockets can easily make the math work. You've got so many one-year contracts without any long-term commitment, guys like Jock Landale, Jayshawn Tate, Jeff Green. Math will not be a problem for the Rockets in these potential deals. So it's just about, can they make the assets line up that makes sense for both sides, and can they convince the player that it's worth it to him? But I'm curious. I mean, we heard Paul George on his podcast last week talk about how he's not really ring chasing. It's about culture. It's about fit. It's about how he wants to play. That could absolutely be a team like the Rockets. It could also be, a team like the Magic. It could be the Spurs. But every day that passes without certainty, and there was the report late last week that the Sixers, are moving on from Paul George. That makes me wonder if maybe they've had something fed to them that PG is looking elsewhere. Now, perhaps the Sixers are playing games themselves and signaling to Paul George, hey, we don't have to have you, so that maybe he'll, accept a lower contract offer. We'll see. I wondered initially if that might be because the Clippers were going to re-sign him, that they had caved and giving him the 4-year max that he undoubtedly wants at his age in his low to mid-30s. But to this point, that hasn't happened. There's no new deal with the Clippers. The Sixers seem to be open to the possibility, at least publicly, of moving on. So that makes me wonder, hey, is there some other team out there? And there's not that many teams that have cap room, and even less amongst teams that can conceivably win next year, i.e. not Detroit. So that brings me to opt-in and trade scenarios. We heard Brian Windhorst of ESPN, about as connected as it gets, speculate about that late last week. So the more time passes without any concrete intel about Paul George, and we've run through the scenario on this podcast before, I think it's possible. And with him being a free agent as soon as this offseason, having the ability to potentially leave the Clippers for no compensation, that might be sort of the perfect storm to get him at a relatively low asset cost, i.e. without dipping deep into your young core, if at all. Again, you can make the math work between Dillon Brooks and the expirings. So you might could get him with, Dillon, expirings, and, a couple of future picks without really having to dip into your young core at all and just have Paul George in place of Dillon Brooks, which would be a clear upgrade on a number of levels. And you would have Paul George as a shooter to complement all the young guys, to give them the floor spacing that we've said so often over the past few weeks and months that this team needs. So again, we have not heard any concrete leaks to this point. I have not heard it myself. I promise you I've inquired. I have not gotten confirmation on that, but I'm just saying there's a lot of dots that could connect. There have been a lot of reports that the Rockets are open to making big moves. I don't think the Brandon Ingram / Mikal Bridges tier is enough this offseason. I do think the Donovan Mitchell / Paul George tier would be. And while I don't consider it likely by any means, and especially not likely that they would go to Houston, every day that passes without a Donovan Mitchell extension in Cleveland or without Paul George either getting a new deal with the Clippers or leaking that that his potential pursuit by Philadelphia is back on, makes me wonder if there's a mystery team for both of those guys, and the Rockets could certainly fit on a number of levels. Not saying it's going to happen, but I think it's a possibility that it would be foolish to rule out as we head into the final few days before free agency, which, again, negotiations can officially begin next Sunday, the 30th. Final note on free agency, Kelly Iko had a great article the other day talking about how the Rockets don't want just shooting in terms of who they bring in. He mentioned guys like Gary Harris, Saddiq Bey, although he's recovering from an ACL tear, Talen Horton-Tucker, Alec Burks, guys who can shoot a little bit but also defend. I think all of those could fit, and I think another area they could fit, those are good players, but those are not so good, and some of them are relatively advanced ages as well, they're going to command a full MLE for 4 years. And that's something that if you listen to our Loggerline archive and you check out our salary cap episode a couple of weeks ago with Yossi Gosselin, the option to have cap space in 2025 for the Rockets, which they could do by declining Fred VanVleet's team option, is very important to them. That gives them a lot of leverage in trade talk, hypothetically, for someone like Donovan Mitchell in Cleveland. And so I'm hesitant to see the Rockets to buy in on them offering a 4-year MLE. They will have a non-taxpayer MLE. They're not close to luxury tax. So in theory, yeah, you can offer $13 million a year, which is about what the non-taxpayer MLE will be this summer, and try to bring in like a Buddy Hield type. It's possible from a financial standpoint. It wouldn't be that prohibitive, and that would certainly address a need for the Rockets in terms of shooting. I think, last year's team, you're going to have most of the rotation back. You add Tari Eason and Steven Adams. I think the idea is that you'll upgrade the Aaron Holiday spot to someone that's a little bit bigger. That's why those guys we just mentioned, guys like Gary Harris, Talen Horton-Tucker, Saddiq Bey, I think Eric Gordon was mentioned as an option as well. Those could fit because I think with Amen Thompson transitioning to more of a point guard in the years ahead, then that sort of 10th man on your bench doesn't have to be like Holiday was, an undersized ball handler. You can have more defensive versatility, more length, because you don't need the handle as much as you did a year ago when Amen still had some training wheels on him. So I think that will be the thinking. But I also think that because you're going a tier below the Buddy Hield types, you can probably get them on a 1-year deal, or maybe a 1-year deal with some team options, a partial guarantee, something like that for years 2 and 3. Because I think that's going to be very important for the Rockets, preserving that possibility of having max space, assuming they don't make a big deal. Now, if they do make a big deal this summer, then maybe the calculus changes and you just get the best guy you can, years be damned. But if they're still wanting to maintain that flexibility, then I think the odds suggest they will probably go the route of they'll spend the MLE, or at least a decent chunk of it. Maybe you want to save some of it for during the season in case you find someone internationally or in the G League that you want to give potentially a 4-year developmental deal to. There's value in that. But I think the Rockets won't just spend to spend because they do want to maintain the flexibility. So I think they'll look for guys who could command a decent chunk of change, maybe $9-10 million a year, but are more likely to take a deal that only has 1 year or 1.5 fully guaranteed, something like that, because that preserves the optionality in 2025. So I think that's part of the thinking. It's not so much that the names we laid out, Alec Burks, Talen Horton-Tucker, Gary Harris, Saddiq Bey, it's not that those are the best you could do. If you offered the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is like 4 years at $55 million combined, you could probably do a little bit better. But I just don't think the slight upgrade in talent or youth for the 10th spot in your rotation as the team is currently constructed is worth the hit to your financial flexibility in 2025. I think what they want to do is go a slightly lower tier in exchange for having friendlier contracts. In much the same way last summer when the Brook Lopez pursuit didn't pan out, as opposed to getting what was truly the next best center on the market, they looked for guys like Jacques Landale and Jeff Green that would take terms that were friendlier to the team, that gave them more options for down the line. I think that's what's likely to happen in free agency as well. The Rockets will certainly be active. I think they view shooting and defensive versatility as needs, but I don't think they'll just hand out a blank check for as many years as the player wants and try to get the best guy on the market for that money. No, I do think that years in particular, it's not so much the figure on their books for next year, it's about the amount of years that they would be committing to financially. I think that's a factor with all these extensions coming up and with the possibility of cap space in 2025 and what that can do for your leverage on the trade market. That's why I think they'll go in that Gary Harris tier that Kelly reported, and I think that's just fine. You add in a Gary Harris, Talen Horton-Tucker, Alec Burks, someone like that to the 9-man rotation that you have today, and that's before we even consider whoever the Rockets bring in the draft, and I'd feel pretty good about this team going into training camp. So I think that's the likely scenario as far as what they will do, barring a major deal that consolidates the roster and opens up other needs. And maybe that happens. Maybe we're having a different conversation in a few days about Paul George or Donovan Mitchell. I do think that you shouldn't close the door to that. But again, until we hear anything concrete, I think that's inherently very unlikely. I just think that every day that passes, my ears perk up a little bit. I get a little more curious. And so that's where I'm at as of Sunday, the 23rd, state of play for the Rockets entering draft week. And now basically a week until free agency negotiations can officially begin on June 30th. Although, of course, we know behind the scenes, many of those negotiations and debates are happening as we speak. All right, that will do it for this mini episode of The Logger Line. Again, we'll have more commentary throughout the week. This was just to give sort of an initial primer for what to expect in the final hours for the draft and free agency. We'll be back with full coverage over the next few days. Until then, if you want more insight, the best place to get it is on Twitter. I'm on there, or X, but come on, it's still Twitter. I'm on there at Ben DuBose. Paolo's on there at Paolo Alves NBA, and the show is on there at The Logger Line, where if you go to the link tree, you can hit up the links to all of our friends, partners, and sponsors: USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of the team. Consume their content. We'd appreciate it. And also, you can find the links to our distributors: Apple, Google, Spotify, so on and so forth. Please subscribe if you've not already. Leave a 5-star review. You'll get the benefit of episodes right when they come out, and we will get the benefit, with hopefully your happy review, of looking good to those friends, partners, and sponsors and keeping this program running as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with those plugs complete, we'll adjourn for this episode of The Logger Line. Please come back later in the week for more.